Hello, third time lucky. Hopefully, I can get through this without the bloody window cleaner interrupting again and again and again. So, I've done a couple of online radio interviews, broadcasts with an American station about my books, and it was the same lady interviewing me both times. And one of the questions she asked first time was, "What books would you like to write about? Kind of topics would you like to write about in the future?" So we had a discussion on that. And one of the issues I suggested was storytelling ethics. And we discussed the same idea again because she was quite keen on it in the second interview. Now, as I said, I think it's such an obscure subject that if I wrote it, I'd probably only manage to sell 3 copies because I don't think there's that many people who, frankly, are interested in it. But nonetheless, for me, it's an interesting thing, and so I'm going to reflect on it here rather than write a book about it. So I went online, had a look at what's out there, and typing in storytelling ethics tends to crop up in almost entirely with corporate websites, big charities, big businesses, and largely what they're talking about are the ethics of interviewing people and recording the interviews, either in written form or video form or whatever. So, for example, charities on domestic violence or whatever, where they've gone out and they've interviewed someone, and here's Mary's story about how she survived domestic violence and how this charity helped her. And it is a little bit of kind of back patting in the sense of it's the charity or the corporation saying, "Aren't we marvellous? Look how we help people." And there's the ethical issues they're looking at are essentially the same kind of things I teach when I'm teaching social sciences. That if you're going to be doing research in social sciences, particularly qualitative research, you go out, you interview people, you survey them, and you ask them a bunch of questions, and there are various ethical issues about how you find the people and how you collate their answers and what you do with the sort of autobiographical snippets they've provided you with about their life experiences. And it is a little bit dry. In all honesty, it is a little bit dry as a topic. And it's not really what I mean when I was talking to the lady on the radio broadcast about storytelling ethics. Because what's of interest to me, if not to many other people, is the idea of the ethical context in which myths and legends and folk tales and ghost stories and fairy stories and all of that have been told around campfires for umpty thousand years, and hopefully will continue being told around campfires for many thousands of years yet to come. There are ethical concepts underpinning it and sort of philosophical notions, and in no especially logical order, I'd like to reflect on a few of them. This isn't exhaustive. There's other issues I'm sure I'll just forget about or not touch on that could be touched upon in future, and maybe people in the discussion section would like to bounce around a few ideas on those sorts of things. Now, one issue that crops up, or has done in recent years in storytelling magazines and websites and what have you, is particularly fueled by identity politics, which has bedeviled society in the 21st century. Lots of people have got nothing better to do than talk about themselves endlessly. You get identity politics on the right wing, on the left wing, in centrist politics. In my experience so far, this particular theme, that of cultural appropriation, tends to be much more focused on left-wing identity politics than right-wing identity politics or centrist. Which isn't to say it couldn't crop up elsewhere, but it just tends to seem to be more of a thing on the left than a thing on the right. So the argument is, and it tends not to be so much about storytelling as it is about having dreadlocks or wearing clothing that's specific to one ethnicity, or well, I say specific, more commonly found in one ethnicity than another, and whether someone who is not of that ethnicity, can they have that haircut, can they wear that clothing, can they play that particular musical instrument, or whatever it might be. And to some extent it does crop up as a topic amongst storytellers, a lot of whom are terribly middle class and obsessed with identity politics. As to whether, if you're British, can you tell a Jamaican folktale? If you are Chinese, can you tell a French folktale? All that sort of thing. To me, the answer is, of course you bloody can. If you want to tell it, tell it. What does it matter what your ethnicity is? However, there are some areas which to me seem to be more aesthetic than ethical, but maybe worth touching on a little bit nonetheless. A key problem, which I found myself, and I'm sure plenty of other storytellers have found, is that if a story originates in a culture whose language I am unfamiliar with, then just reading the names of the characters and the places and what have you in a book, you don't automatically know how to pronounce them. And sometimes you're taking a best guess, and even if there is a glossary that says pronounce it this way, how it sounds to you in your head when you pronounce it compared to how a native speaker would pronounce it, even with a phonetic guide, isn't always the same thing. Now, if you get the name a bit wrong, you mispronounce it and it sounds a bit weird, it may be that a native speaker in the audience will fall about laughing because you've accidentally said something really rude by mispronouncing a name. But it's not the end of the world. It's no one's going to drag you out and shoot you because you've mispronounced a name. However, one area of interest to me as a pagan storyteller, which may not be an issue for non-pagan storytellers, is that many pagan cultures, and the Egyptian one is a very obvious example here, have a strong tradition in which names of people, of places, of special objects have a sort of magical potency to them. And it's not exclusive to the Egyptians as an idea. I mean, you can think of all those European folk tales about the kind of Rumpelstiltskin type story where there's some evil goblin with a secret name, and the hero or the heroine of the story has to find out the name of the wicked goblin, and by doing so, usually right at the end of the story, it breaks the magic power the goblin has to control people and force them to do horrid things. And so this notion that certain names, if you know them, give you power over, well, the being whose name it is, usually. Maybe other things do. But they carry some kind of authority with them, some kind of special. It invests the person who knows the name with a certain amount of clout over the world. So that's there is an element there where if you as the storyteller didn't know how to pronounce the name properly and you were getting it wrong, maybe the story would lack a certain vavavoom, a certain magic. Whereas if you did get the name right, maybe that would bring a kind of a power with it. In and of itself, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. What do you do with the power once you've got it? I mean, that's a whole ethical question in itself. How to wield authority and power in an ethical manner. I mean, that's a huge, vast subject in and of itself. For those storytellers who just think a name is a name is a name, and it's there's no real magic to any of it, then this clearly is a nonsense issue. You could say in terms of cultural sensitivity, put the magic to one side, it is polite if you're going to tell a story from somebody else's culture, whether or not there's anyone from that culture sitting in the audience, but if you're going to tell a story from a culture, if you are able to pronounce the names correctly, then it's obviously a polite thing to do. Just as if you're having a conversation with somebody and you keep mispronouncing their name, it's slightly irritating. I mean, not necessarily offensive as such, but it's slightly irking if somebody keeps getting your name wrong. And you keep saying, well, no, it's pronounced like this. And if they still keep getting it wrong, you either conclude that they're deaf as a post and they don't really understand what you've said to them, or are they being intentional, deliberately getting your name wrong? I don't know. But there's a kind of a politeness, shall we say, in wanting to get the names correct. And that's something that will come from perhaps being a native speaker, or at least a confident speaker of the languages. So the more multicultural your repertoire is, the more likely you are, unless you're a phenomenal polyglot, the more likely you are to have stories in your repertoire where the names of characters and places and such like are in a language you don't speak and you're not confident in, and even if you've looked them up in some kind of phonetic glossary, you're still not quite pronouncing them the way a native speaker would pronounce them. So that is it an ethical issue? There's ethical elements to it, but I think if you can get the name right, that's good, and it also gives you as a teller, it gives you the confidence boost that you know you're saying it properly. And that is an advantage, because if you're at the back of your mind you think, well, I'm not really sure how to say this, and you're kind of half expecting someone in the audience to go, "Oi, you got that wrong," then that kind of puts you on the back foot. So having confidence in your pronunciations is good for you as a teller, whatever the sort of the rights and wrongs of mispronouncing words is. Now, in a slightly connected issue, a lot of traditional cultures, and every culture is traditional, so I'm not just talking about cultures of people whose skin colour is different from your own, because I come from a traditional culture. Everyone comes from a traditional culture if you go back far enough. And if you're mixed race, maybe you come from 2 or 3 traditional cultures who are part of your sort of family genetic mix somewhere along the line. But traditional cultures often have some kind of guideline as to who tells stories. So maybe there are certain stories that women tell, and there are a different type of story that men tell, or it's mainly the elderly who tell stories, or it's mainly servants who tell stories to the posh children they look after. There's all kind of guidelines as to who tells what story and when. And some that can be just a sort of bedtime stories to put the kids to sleep, but it can be all the way up to sacred stories. So maybe there are certain stories that only the priests or the priestesses would tell, and they'd only tell them at certain times of the year in that big festival, in the ritual to celebrate the sacred story. And the rest of the year they wouldn't tell those stories, that particular story at any rate. And so there's kind of cultural trappings. And if you're telling the story out of the cultural context, because you're not the priest or the priestess or the whatever traditional folk teller from that, so you're just a random person reading a story that you found in a book, and you're reciting it or telling it in some context, then you might not even know there's that traditional context. You may have no idea. Perhaps the book you found it in didn't tell you about that, so you just kind of telling a story without realising this is meant to be a woman's story and you're a man, or vice versa. Or this is a posh person's story and you're common as muck, or vice versa. So you might not have the insight. Now, again, I don't think that matters. A story can be told well and interestingly, even if you miss out on half of the subtle nuances, because you don't have the cultural insight that this is a woman's story, this is a man's story, this is a warrior's story, this is a priest's story. If you did have those cultural insights, then you might tell the same story in a much richer, fuller, more dynamic way, and be able to offer the audience all sorts of insights that, if you don't have that background, you don't know anything about. And so for some people it might be an ethical issue, kind of appropriating a story and taking it out of context and missing half of its subtle nuances. To me, it's not the end of the world. It's just, let's say it's a missed opportunity, and it would be so much better for you as a teller if you did know the context, because you could add so much more in to what you're telling. There might be issues there where, let's say, if I were to somehow find out the context of what was traditionally a woman's story, would it be right for me to tell it? So, I'm at one level, if you're passing on information, does it matter where the information comes from? But in some cultures, they might think, well, why are you, a bloke, telling what is meant to be a traditional woman's story? Are you kind of treading on toes? Are you barging in to somebody else's preserved territory? So that there could be elements of that in which, if you're not the right kind of person to tell a story, doesn't mean you can't read the story, doesn't mean you can't enjoy the story, but there might be cultural contexts in which some people go, should you really be telling this story, or should that person over there be the one telling this story? To some extent, that can also become a creative act, a sort of an aesthetic act. Like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Thomas Stoppard's play of, you've got a story, in this case a theatrical story, literary story, in which somebody says, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if this story were retold, not by the main characters who usually tell it, but by those characters over there. Let's bring them to the centre of the story. I can't remember the name of the author now, but years ago, I read a version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which the story was told from the perspective of the housemaid, about all the comings and goings on in the house as she sees the doctor and then she sees Mr. Hyde, and all of this is going on. And that was quite an interesting take. The fundamentals of the story didn't change, because it really annoys me when people do that and they butcher a story, and I end up thinking, well, why do you even bloody bother if you're going to butcher it that much? That particular author kept the fundamentals of the story, but they put the interesting spin on what would all of this drama taking place seem like to the housemaid, to a character who, well, doesn't even feature at all in the main story. But obviously, rich doctors have housemaids, so one's there even if they're never referred to directly. They do talk about the servants, but not in the way that particular author took the approach. So you can take a traditional story, a myth, legend, whatever it may be, and think, well, how would this appear? How would it be understood from the perspective of one of the very minor characters who doesn't normally get featured much in traditional tellings of it, and you kind of spin the story a bit, which I suppose if we're trying to somehow link this into social sciences, I don't know why I should, but Sandra Harding, an American sociologist, developed the idea of standpoint theory. Well, technically she didn't invent the theory, but she became quite well known for writing about it. And that's her idea that certain sorts of people back in the 1960s were primarily heard from in academia. Certain types of people in America wrote most of the books, gave most of the lectures, and wouldn't it be interesting, she said, if other types of people, the ones that hardly any ever get heard from, if they had an opportunity to do the research, write the books, deliver the lectures, put their own particular understanding from their background onto the world. And I think social science waffle to one side, that's quite a valid point of view, that it can be interesting to understand a tale from a different stance. The famous story of what the Greeks refer to as Osiris and Set, his brother, when there's the war raging between them. Almost always that story is told from the viewpoint of Osiris and the good guys in the story. What would that story be like if it were told from the perspective of Set, of the Lord of the Desert, of the god who is conspiring to commit the murder, rather than the one who is the victim of the murder? How would he present himself in that story? So he's not a minor character, but he's a character whose own voice is very rarely heard directly. In fact, all of the myths I'm aware of that involves Set, or Setech as I prefer to call him, he is shall we say, a subsidiary player. They're very rarely stories directly centred wholly on him, in which his point of view and his motivations, his drive, his wishes, his hopes are centre stage. We hear about him, but we don't hear from him. And that, I think, from a kind of a pagan point of view, a religious point of view, to understand sacred stories from differing perspectives. Why is this goddess doing that? Why is that god doing this? Why has that king gone and done so and so? Often you're given a version of the story told from a certain angle. To think about it from different angles opens up interesting philosophical dimensions and interesting understandings of the dynamic of what's really going on in that story at a much deeper level, a much kind of richer level. And I think that's quite an interesting angle to go down, and quite a worthwhile avenue to explore. Okay, slightly changing tack in terms of thinking about dynamics and so on, and ethical concepts. A lot of stories, particularly those geared for kids, have a moral to the message. Sometimes very explicit, you get to the end of the story and it's the moral is blah blah blah, and sometimes it's just implicit and the listener is left to twig out of their own common sense what the moral of the message is. Now there is an issue in which you could say, whose morality is this that's being imparted? Is it the storyteller's morality? Well, they could just be repeating a story they heard from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone, and perhaps nobody has got a clue who very first told that story. It's such an old story. The original author is lost in the mists of time, and so quite whose moral point of view it was being put across, no one can say with any certainty anymore. But which doesn't invalidate the moral, of course. But it's interesting to know. Again, this idea of different characters and different stances, that morals often represent a certain approach to life and a different strata of society, a different type of person, a different individual might have a different moral take on certain things. And so you could get into the situation of saying some moral perspectives are heard quite a lot, other moral perspectives maybe are rarely heard, because the kind of people who have those moral perspectives are rarely allowed to tell their own stories, or rarely allowed to put them into writing and record them and have them carried out into the world. And so there might be certain moral stances that are seldom heard from. So thinking of a story in which you allow for a different moral stance gives a chance to explore different issues, different concepts, come at it from a different angle, give voice to people who might not often get voice given to them, especially if you're one of those people, to kind of give yourself voice in that sense. And you could also have a story in which you have more than one moral. So the idea is that you've got this moral value and that moral value, and let's see how they play off against each other in the story. And the audience can be left to decide they prefer moral A or moral B, and which makes more sense to them in terms of how the different characters act from differing moral perspectives. What was his name? Bakhtin, the Russian writer, talked about this idea of polyphony, many voices. So he was talking about novels, but you could apply the same concept to oral storytelling, that different characters could represent different points of view, and the story becomes a way of exploring and bouncing those different points of view off each other to see where they lead to, and is one point of view better, preferable to another point of view in terms of the life choices that characters make and where they end up and where it leaves them by the end of the story as to the consequences of their actions. So that could be something to explore. Now, in a similar sort of a vein, I have touched on this in previous recordings some time back in the past. There is an argument from people like Dowling, who wrote the Cinderella Complex back in the 1970s sometime, that certain morals, certain themes crop up an awful lot in traditional folktales. So you hear the same things again and again and again. So there's a huge number of stories in which there are three brothers, occasionally three sisters, but usually three brothers. And the youngest one is the sensible one who does all the right things, and the older brothers are selfish and stupid and greedy and do all the wrong things. And so, again, without that kind of different moral voices, you've got the selfish brother goes and does this, and the stupid brother goes and does that. And the wise brother, who is the youngest, usually the kind of the more neglected character, who makes good, they come in and do the right things, and this story goes well for them and badly for the other two. So you kind of have that notion of things in sets of threes, and it's the least attended to presence, the least valued of the brothers, who turns out to be the good one. And the underpinning moral theme, if you like, is to not undervalue something or someone, and to reconsider that sometimes the least valued, the most ill-treated, the most neglected, turns out, like King Lear and the daughters, the one who gets the shortest shrift turns out to be the best one. So that's a common theme that crops up in a lot of stories. But Dowling's argument was that from a female perspective, she was obviously coming at it from a feminist point of view, was that a lot of stories about female characters, heroines, which are aimed primarily at young girls to listen to, well, obviously a young boy could listen to them too, but mainly she was saying, what impact does this have on young girls hearing this kind of story 1,000 times over? Because it's not just one story, her argument is that the same ideas crop up again and again and again, lots of different stories, and if you keep hearing the same thing, it has a drip, drip, drip effect and shapes how you think. And if the common underlying Cinderella type story, ill-treated young woman drudging away, waiting for handsome prince to come along and rescue her, what does that set up as a storytelling expectation? If you've heard that 1,000 times over, in the back of your head sets this idea that if your life is crap, you just have to wait for some nice bloke to come along and sort it all out for you and whisk you off to a palace and it'll be all lovely, smashing. If you're being ill-used by your grotty, ugly sisters and your horrible stepmother and all these nasty, unpleasant people, then again, you don't have to have an argument with them, you don't have to bash them on the head with the nearest blunt instrument, you just have to put up, shut up and wait for some bloke to come along and sort it all out for you. Her concern was that it would lead to a sort of mental passivity, that young women whose lives were rubbish, instead of getting off their bums and sorting their problems out and taking charge of their own life, would just sit and wait and wait and wait and wait for some bloke. Maybe once in a blue moon a nice bloke would turn up and sort out their problems, but frequently they'd still be waiting when they were 85 and nothing would have happened to sort out the problems in their lives, which for Dowling, most people I imagine, was a bad thing. So her argument is that at one level, a fairy story is just a funny little story and does it matter? But at another level, if you constantly hear the same thing, not just in fairy stories, but in films and TV shows and in novels, and you're constantly exposed to the same plot line again and again and again, it will shape how you think. So it's that constant exposure. So you could make an argument, although those books I've read that do take a very conscious, right, I'm now going to tell an empowering story. God, they can do it really badly. Something it's not so much hearing a story as being smashed on the head with a sledgehammer. People need to learn the art of subtlety rather than the art of sledgehammering their audiences into thinking a certain thing. And I suspect that's half the problem, is that when you make a very conscious effort, right, I'm now going to do this, try and do it subtly. Otherwise it goes, but I mean, I've made this mistake myself in storytelling, where I've wanted to tell a certain type of story, and the end result is just crap. It really is, because it lacks subtlety, it lacks what you might call a kind of a casual grace, where some stories, they just unfold and they happen. They're not forced, they're not shoved. You've not got this constant sense of some rather shrill agenda nagging in your ear, or they just sort of unfold. And those are the better type of stories, because they're more palatable, they're more listenable, they're more engaging than something that's terribly worthy and heavy-handed and rather condescending in terms of how it puts its message across. But yeah, going back to the key point, whether a message is put across subtly or condescendingly or whatever else, if you're telling a story, you are putting a message across, arguably. Is that message a good one to hear? Or is it maybe having a drip, drip, drip effect on the audience because they've heard similar messages from similar stories 1,000 times already, and maybe it's shaping the way they think in a less than helpful manner? So that there is that kind of encouragement, I suppose we could say, to think about the morality of the messages you're putting across. Not all of them, maybe some of them don't have a morality, fair enough. But if they do, whose morality is it? what impact does that morality have on the audience? Kind of to think about that in a creative sense. Now, another issue which crops up both in academia as well as in storytelling is that of plagiarism. Now, one of the troubles with a lot of folklore and tradition is that nobody actually knows who the originator of a story was. It's so old that the original person is lost in the mists of time, so there is no one to accredit it to. I suppose you could accredit it to a general culture and say, well, this is a traditional Greek story, this is a traditional Korean story, or whatever it might be, to acknowledge the cultural source, even if you don't know the name of the actual specific person who very first came up with it, which is fair. And I suppose the main thing is not to plagiarise, not to pass off as your invention something you found from somewhere else. Or if you put your own spin on it, to say, well, this I found this as a traditional story, but I changed it a bit. This is my version of it, rather than word for word the traditional version of it. And part of that, again, is going back to this initial notion of ownership. Who owns the stories? There are quite literary stories, be like Montague James and people like that, who tell these really fabulous stories, who lend themselves to being retold and retold. And somewhere along the line, a story may have changed so much it's no longer the original story, it's now the property of somebody else, in a sense. Obviously, once you've told a story, whether you tell it around the campfire or you tell it to a screen or whatever other context you're telling a story in, once it's out there, it is out there, and it's no longer your story. It's not owned in the same way. And as countless people have found, authors and so on, if their stories prove popular, audiences will tend to innovate and want to kind of tell their own versions of the stories, or at least take the characters and dream up a new plot line and say, well, what would happen if Sherlock Holmes did this, or Harry Potter did that, or whoever the character would be. And they start spinning their own stories, which can lead to legal ramifications sometimes, in terms of legal ownership of registered stories. But traditional stories, what would happen if Ariadne had done this? What would happen if Hecate did that? Which is interesting territory, especially if you're getting onto actual deities, Hecate and so on. Should you have free license to tell any old story about them? Or do you have to bear in mind, as a pagan, I would suggest you'd have to bear this in mind, that those are actual beings, and they might be listening. And they might not like the stories you make up about them. So if you're going to tell a story about an actual being, I think it's worth consulting the being in question to find out whether or not they want that story told about them. Or better yet, allow them to tell their own stories, because this is a question, you go back to this kind of plagiarism issue. If it's an ancient myth or legend, who very first told it? Was it just dreamt up by somebody around a campfire who thought, well, I've got an hour to kill, right, I'll just make up some old story about Zeus? Or were stories of the gods conveyed? Did somebody have a vivid dream and wake up and say, oh, I must tell you this dream, and that became the myth and was told and retold and retold, because the gods, Zeus, spoke to that person in a dream, who then woke up and retold it. So a kind of a visionary experience. Or I say a dream, maybe they were chewing a mushroom, maybe they were necking an awful lot of wine and sleeping in the temple of Dionysus, and then woke up and told a story they had this vivid visionary experience of. Those stories could, you might argue, originate at a mystical level, not simply be something some bloke made up to kill an hour, but something that was revelatory, was visionary to begin with. And so if we're going to perpetuate stories, and so let's say comic book characters like Thor, where an actual mythical being has been mutated into a comic book character, and the stories told in the comic books are clearly just made up by somebody or other without any visionary mystical context to them. Do the gods in question get a bit narked? I've no idea. Is it a moral carte blanche to tell any old story you feel like telling about a character who has a reality to them, or is the literary version so abstracted from the actual being upon whom they are based that they've become two totally separate things? I suspect so in the case of comic book characters. The comic book version has no bearing or relationship to the actual entity that the name has derived from, ultimately. But it's an interesting topic to open up as to the kind of what can you do if you take a character, or even a historical character, let alone an entity of mythical proportions. But let's say a historical character who is much loved in one culture, and you tell a story about that historical personage that you've just made up that makes them sound a complete idiot or an absolute monster, or is less than flattering in some way, you're probably going to upset people from that culture to whom that historical person is a great hero. So again, should you have carte blanche to tell any old story about any old person and somebody doesn't like it, tough tits? Or do you have a moral responsibility to think, well, this person is a great hero in that culture, or they're a terrible villain in that culture, and so trying to tell a story about a villain that makes them sound good could be as offensive as telling a story about a hero that makes them sound bad. So how do you what kind of responsibility do you have to the people from the culture to whom that historical person belongs to not upset them by insulting their heroes or whitewashing their villains? And you get added characters who, like Alexander the Great, in some parts of the world they're heroes, and in other parts of the world they're villains, depending on what they did to the local populace. So they exist both as heroes and as villains in different parts of the world. And so you get into really grey moral territory when it comes to creating spontaneous news stories that are based around historical persons. So that kind of opens up some weird and wonderful realms to contemplate and think about. There are a bunch of other issues to think about. I'll finish with one. I think I don't waffle too much. That was raised by a friend of mine, Fiona, a year or two ago, possibly a bit longer than that, where she had gone along to a storytelling event expecting it to be folk tales and myths and legends and so on, and the person who was performing, is like a ticketed event, the person who was performing started to tell stories about their own life, kind of autobiographical stories about their recovery from a serious illness which had directly affected a member of Fiona's family, and she was kind of shocked, I suppose, upset in that she had been expecting a kind of like a nice evening of folk stories, and suddenly this very raw emotional account that had a very direct relevance to a very painful, upsetting experience in her own life, which clearly the storyteller didn't know that. But the point here is that the storyteller didn't warn the audience. So the audience expected one thing and they got another. And had the storyteller said, look, this is what I want to talk about, if anyone in the audience might find this a bit too painful, now's your chance to go and get a pint at the bar and skip this part of the performance, that would have been better. So there is a consent issue in terms of whether the audience are paying or not paying is kind of almost besides the point. But I suppose it becomes more to the point if they are paying than if they're not, that they come along with certain expectations of what they're going to get, and if the storyteller has no intention of delivering on those expectations, they are intending to do something entirely different, then maybe they need to breach that with the audience first and say that this is what I'm intending to do. Is this okay with you? And if it's not, either you change your storytelling set, or at least you give members of the audience a chance to go somewhere else if they don't want to sit and listen to whatever it is that you are intending to tell them. Now, whether that's personal anecdotes of severe illness, or let's say somebody has been a refugee in their life and they've fled war-torn horrors in some other country, and they're intending to talk about all of the horrific things they've seen. It's more likely to be an issue if the teller is going to touch on something painful and unpleasant than if they're just going to tell German fairy stories instead of French fairy stories, which is, still fairy stories at the end of the day. So those kind of changes may be a bit more minor and might not need flagging up, but especially if the topic is going to be quite a challenging one, quite a traumatic one, then maybe there is a moral responsibility on the part of the teller to say, look, this is what you're going to get. Are you happy getting this? Before launching into the stories. Of course, an element of this which can be challenging for tellers is that you don't always know what the audience would consider challenging in the first place. One audience might not be fazed by a type of story that another audience is deeply fazed by. Let's go for a fairly minor example. Let's say you're going to tell, love stories or something, and the audience are expecting boy meets girl type stuff, and you're intending to include an ancient Greek myth of boy meets boy. Now, some audiences they'd think, oh, that's nice, fair enough, whatever, and wouldn't cause an issue. But other audiences, who maybe if they're of somewhat more conservative moral points of view, might go, can't cope with it, all these gay stories, it's all a bit too much. Do you have to warn them? You'd think in the 21st century, maybe not, but some audiences might say, well, I thought you were going to do this type of story, and you've just mortified me by doing that type of story. You should have said, and stomp off out in high dudgeon. So knowing what would be considered shocking to an audience is sometimes a bit of a guessing game. And it raises the question of what you should or shouldn't have to warn audiences about. What you should expect them to go along with, and what you might need to think, well, maybe this is a quite painful, difficult, awkward, challenging topic, and we need to be a bit more upfront. If they come along expecting cute stories and you tell them the most horrifying ghost stories you've ever heard of and scare the living daylights out of them and give them nightmares for a fortnight, clearly you are delivering something that they had not expected to have. So there are certain contexts in which that might need to be thought about and agreed upon with the audience before you let flood. You could argue, again, come back to pagan issues here. A lot of old pagan cultures believed that certain stories were quite magical. So hearing the theogony, the creation of the world from the perspective of the Greeks, was believed to have this sort of release the presence of the gods into the room, and it would have this magical healing beneficial effect upon the audience. If an audience turn up who are very secular and they're just thinking, oh, this is going to be a nice way of killing a few hours and listening to a few bits of old folktale, and what you deliver them is some transformative, therapeutic, spiritual healing experience, did they consent to that? Do you have a right just to launch that on an audience without them knowing that that's what you're intending to launch on an audience? I'd suggest not. If you're intending to do something consciously magical, and I say consciously because some stories you could tell what you think is just a nice twee little story that has some really amazing effect on somebody in the audience that you had no idea would have that effect on them, which is, if you don't know it's going to have the effect, then but what can you do about that? But if you expect, because you come from a culture where this story is seen as profound and spiritual and transformative, and so you're expecting something quite profound to happen to the audience, letting them know ahead of time is probably quite a nice idea. So they can either go, oh, I don't want that happening to me, and leave, or they can go, yep, fabulous, I don't mind that, or they can say, well, I think you're a bit loopy and it's just a story and your expectations are unrealistic, so I'm going to listen anyway, which is their choice, and stay put and listen. So there's elements there. There are other things we could talk about, but we'll perhaps leave those for another time, and leave this one here for now. But it'd be interesting to hear your points of view. Are there issues you think are worth noting in terms of storytelling ethics? How you respond to the issues I've touched upon, as well as issues you would like to be touched upon in future recordings.